Oh boy! Hi! Welcome to Book and Page. The place of the line continues. And I told you I would try not to beat the dead horse that is my anger at Anthony and Damaris' relationship. But too terribly bad, Charles Williams gotta give me yet another chapter, nor is it the last one, that focuses specifically on this. Anger. So much anger. Let's start with the summary, shall we? So, Chapter 9 is called The Fugitive. And we start with Damaris, who has gone off on a walk to get some peace, though we're told by the author that she doesn't know what peace actually is. She's just fooling herself and continually forcing peace away from herself. I'll get to it. I will get to it. She is grappling with a couple questions about her own work, how far she should go in her reading, in her appendix. Also the fact that, like, her father's acting weird, and Anthony's acting weird, and finally she just sits down and gets some work done. Only to be interrupted by a voice in the ditch behind her that it turns out belongs to Quentin, who is on the run, hiding in a ditch, insisting that she needs to hide. Now, he's sort of like, well, hide over there, and then he realizes who she is. And when Damaris refuses to get into the ditch with him, he actually grabs hold of her and pulls her down, saying he's only doing this because she's Anthony's girl. Damaris and Quentin end up sort of fighting with each other, and she's trying to get away, and she ends up screaming enough that we hear thunder in the distance, which we've been told, of course, is the roar of the lion, and Quentin freaks out, assuming that Damaris has drawn attention to them, and he books it, lets her go and books it, and she runs out of the ditch, just angry. So angry, understandably, I think. But we'll get to that. And eventually takes herself home. In the evening, though, she's really unsettled and upset about the whole situation. She realizes Quentin probably wasn't there and was in deep need of help that she hadn't provided. So ultimately she feels rather guilty that she wasn't able to help him. And when Anthony arrives next morning, she admits what actually happened. Rather than, being excited to hear that Quentin's alive, Anthony just gets real angry at Damaris' response. Hi, kitty. Yes, hi, kitty. I'll bring my own lion in. Gets really angry at Damaris' response, but pushes past that. To ask her to go to London. Damaris, having no idea what's actually going on, and not having anyone explain anything to her, sees no reason to go to London. She's deeply upset by all of this, and says no. Anthony kind of just says, yeah, okay, whatever. And saying that, what he admits is he's done trying to convince her, and he cannot yet cajole. So, he fully admits there's a point where he's just going to try and force her to do what he wants. Now is not the time. He's got to go and meet Dr. Rockbotham to visit Mr. Beringer, and so they part ways, both deeply unhappy about the outcome of the conversation. Can you see where I might be a little upset? All of it. All of it is deeply upsetting, especially with the fact that we cannot purely say that the sort of underlying message about Damaris being an awful person because she's a woman who thinks on things that she would like and wants to complete her education and is trying to focus on her thesis and doesn't want to get married to a dude who's her cousin and just keeps insisting and not listening to her. That perspective is not just Anthony's perspective. This chapter tells us quite firmly it is also William's perspective, because he undermines her constantly throughout this chapter without needing to be from Anthony's point of view. The whole, she doesn't know what peace actually is, like, very direct. Like, so she's gone for a walk because she's trying to focus on things, though she's never really found peace in nature. She finds it in her philosophers, though she's wrong about that. Peace to her was not a state to be achieved, but a supposed necessary condition of her daily work, and peace, therefore, as often happens, evaded her continually. She emanated peace so often and so loudly that she inevitably frightened it still further away, peace itself being, so far as it had yet been found, a loveliness only evocable by a kind of sympathetic magic and auto-hypnotism which it never occurred to her to exercise. Like, what? Like, cool. You don't like this character. Got it. Excellent. It continues on into her schoolwork with the very snide comment. So, yeah, okay. However, here she was away from them, and a good thing too, for this business of the relationship of the divine perfection with creation was giving her, as it had given the schoolmen, a little trouble. Welcome to academia. We try to ask questions and propose answers for questions we're never going to be able to answer. Welcome to academia. Plato's absolute beauty, she quite saw, was all right, because it was not necessarily conscious of the world. But the god of Abelard was conscious of the world, and yet that consciousness must not be necessary to him, for nothing but himself could be necessary to him. Here, we actually get a moment where Damaris seems to be, in her own way, connecting to the issue at large. Because this was precisely the issue of the change of hypothesis that we covered last chapter. Where originally the idea was the forms don't have an opinion of the fact that they're colliding into this world. But if we are changing that from the Platonic forms, the Platonic absolutes, to a religious viewpoint, then we are seeing a consciousness of the world, an understanding of what's happening, and a purpose for it. Though, again, if God is good, what is the purpose here? Like, Damaris is actually asking a question that is connected to the issue at large. She, of course, is focused on her own work. And we're going to dig into that later. She then goes on to St. Thomas, only he was later. She didn't want to bring him in, still a short appendix, perhaps, bringing the history of the idea up to St. Thomas, ... just to show that she had read well beyond her subject, ... St. Thomas would be a good stopping place, and she might reasonably not pursue it further. She then goes on to think whether or not all of this should be an appendix, who all she should include, and then she saw on her left a style, mounted it, sat down, took out her notes on the problem, and set to work on them. Half an hour went by quite pleasantly. And again, that comment with the ... surrounding it is supposed to be a draw point of us, of being like, oh, Damaris, again, wants everyone to think she's super smart, just to show she'd read beyond her subject. I have done my BA and my MA, and the answer is, yes, you do that. It is not actually, I want people to think I'm smart. It is literally a requirement to be able to show that you have read broadly in relationship to a very narrow subject that you are writing on. It's a thing that you do, and it's normal. So by putting this statement in the ... it again characterized Damaris in a negative light. But it's completely normal. What the abnormal part of this is the fact that Damaris is a woman in a mainly male academic sphere who is fighting constantly to get somewhere. And she mentions this earlier, like, part of her relationship with Anthony is because he works with the two camps and helps get papers published. He and she think they're good papers, but nobody else will take them. That's because they're on very narrow subjects, probably take a differing opinion from the common thought, and she's a woman who's very opinionated. Horror-bee. No. Reading beyond your profession is expected. Especially in this case, where she very logically, following this point, sets out the thought process here. Because a big part of this, you are going to be asked this question. If you ever write a thesis, you are going to be asked this question. Which is, if you were to continue on this subject, where would you go from here? And you need to be able to be like, well, I find this idea really attractive. So, like, Damaris doing this is so she can point to that appendix and be like, if I was to continue this project, I would then continue on towards St. Thomas, because he's got a really interesting perspective that continues through this historical line of philosophers and theologians. Like, that's what you do. But the entire setup of this chapter is demonizing Damaris for her academic interests. This isn't, we set up that whole thing about she doesn't actually know what peace is. Oh, she just wants everyone to think we're smart, and end there. Because it then goes on to undermine her intelligence. In, like, the stupidest way. So, after her encounter with the fugitive Quentin, which we are going to return to, she is feeling guilty because she recognized after the fact, after she had calmed down, that he was probably in trouble and desperately needed help. She didn't provide it to him, or was unable to provide it to him, and she is feeling guilty. This is not a completely selfish person like Anthony, and sometimes the narration is trying to make you believe. If she was, she wouldn't be nearly this bothered by it. But her mind is going a little screwy, she's really stressed out, something traumatic kind of just happened to her. She was physically attacked by a person, and she ends up thinking on all of this gets mixed in. All her thoughts about her work, about Quentin, a couple of lines from one of Abelard's own hymns, especially rang in her ears, as such things will. I'm not going to read the Latin, but there the Latin is. Followed by the line, until her maddened mind produced, in brackets, incorrectly. As a translation, truth is always in the thing, never in the reasoning. Incorrectly. I looked it up, okay? I looked it up, because I was like, what is it then? If the translation incorrectly is truth is always in the thing, never in the reasoning, what does it actually mean? Truth is in the thing itself, never in the reasoning. I'm sorry, no. Her translation she has some words off. Her translation overall is correct. We can argue about this. The second half is fully correct, never in the reasoning. Is verbatim correct. So the first half, she has truth is always in the thing, and truth is in the thing itself. So you might argue about always, but always is just the opposite of never, right? If it's never in the reasoning, then it's always got to be in the thing itself. That's the other thing missing. Itself. She doesn't have the thing itself. She just has the thing. Williams here is undermining Damaris to the point that if you don't go ahead and look up the quote yourself, then you can assume that she is somehow absurdly wrong about this translation. She's not. She's off by 2 words. I had a professor who did this, and it was the Bible. He wanted a quote verbatim from the Bible during a quiz. He told us, of course, before the class, that which Bible we used didn't matter. Yes, it does if you're going to ask verbatim, because translations vary. In the different Bibles that class had, there were 3 different versions of the quote written out. In the footnotes of the quote, there were about 5 different ways. Standing here and saying this quote is incorrectly translated, or demanding a verbatim quote from a source that can vary, is just somebody putting their own academic excellence on a podium and saying you're not worthy. And yes, am I heated right now? I am. Because that professor deeply affected not only my first year at university, but several other students, to the point where several of them didn't continue in that line of classes, and at least one of them didn't continue university. Because for him, you either got a question wrong, or the question was rhetorical and you were never meant to answer. That's the feeling I get from both Anthony and the narration by Williams here. Damaris is incorrect because she doesn't get it perfectly, she thinks her own way, and she's a woman. She's not following the man's lead constantly. She's fighting for her own way in an academic world where she wants to work on what she wants to work on. And somehow all of that is wrong. It's frustrating, because you think maybe it's just Anthony's perspective. It's the author's. And Damaris is ultimately going to be... God. We'll get there in a few chapters, but there's one point where she starts apologizing, and Anthony, to her face, says that yes, she's acted like Lilith's firstborn. If you're wondering who Lilith is, she was supposedly the first woman created for Adam, made out of dirt like Adam was. And then she didn't want to listen to Adam. So she got kicked out of the garden and became the mother of monsters. Because yes, calling your girlfriend who you want to marry, and supposedly love so much that you deeply want to protect her, the daughter of Lilith, it's a great way of doing it. In fact, that aggression is even in this chapter. Anthony actually threatens to harm her. Don't believe me? Well, she admits that she had the confrontation with Quentin. Quentin grabbed hold of her, refused to call her by name, kept insisting to, again, that association with a man. He's doing all of this because she's Anthony's girl. Not Damaris, a person who deserves to not be killed by big scary things coming in. Damaris is understandably frightened and upset and being physically accosted. Her responding by trying to get away, even physically, is perfectly acceptable. So Anthony turning on her and saying that she's wrong for having done this and getting angry is completely unacceptable. I wouldn't marry this man if he was the last man on Earth. He constantly gaslights her, and like I said, threatened to attack her. So she tells him what's happened. And then we get this from Anthony's perspective. Again, we're supposed to feel for him, and I can't. I'm just so angry about this. Anthony looked at her, and then took a turn through the room. Before his eyes, as he looked, she had seemed to change. The thought of Quentin, cast off, kicked at by her outraged anger, hurt him profoundly, and the somber eyes through which he surveyed her saw a different, nastier Damaris. Yet he had known it all along. Only that she should treat him as she did was part of the joke of things. That she should treat Quentin so seemed somehow so much worse. He attacked her. She defended herself. she's a bitch. She's always been a bitch, because she wants to focus on her own academic career. But of course, it wasn't worse. It was the same Damaris. Those whom he loved were at war, but love itself wasn't and couldn't be at war. He loved her, and she had persecuted his friend. He attacked her, and she defended herself. And felt guilty about it afterwards. Damaris isn't a bad person, Anthony. You are. But he loved them both, and therefore there was no taking of sides. Also the fact that you've abandoned Quentin to the wilderness. Like, despite you claiming he's a very good friend, and you're deeply upset at Damaris for defending herself when Quentin attacked her, you have failed to seek him out entirely in the past, what, 3 days? His heart ached in him. But as he came back to her, his eyes were smiling, even though his face had been struck by pain. He's being the bigger man here. He quotes something in Latin. Pausing near her. Those things Sabbath the Blessed One see, dearest, you'll be like the fellow in the New Testament. You'll meet Abelard one day, and he'll stare at you and say he never knew you. I suppose you know you've been a pig. If this is how you respond when someone says, I went through this traumatic experience, but I feel bad because I think the person needed help, and I wasn't able to help them, please help them, and you say, you've been a pig about all of this, don't expect that person to open up to you anymore. Damaris understandably says, don't talk to me like that, Damaris said, and in the contention of emotions within her, she added absurdly, it was a great shock to me. And again, there's the narration undermining Damaris. Yes, it was a great shock to her. She was being attacked and almost kidnapped by forcibly being taken into the ditch by a crazy man. But she's being absurd here. You've got a worse shock than that coming to you, he answered. Why do you always talk as if I don't know anything? She asked. That's actually a really good question. Again, the narration undermines it, opening another attack on more favorable ground. She's being aggressive with this. But it's an honest question. Why do you always talk to me like I'm a child that doesn't know anything? Because we know this is Anthony's perspective. He's constantly said she's being childish and ignorant. Tell her something. And then added to distract him further, and then you expect me to marry you. Yeah, no, that's another great question. You treat me like an idiot, you refuse to talk to me plainly about things, and then you expect me to marry you. I don't expect anything at all, he said. Lies. Not from anybody. More lies, least of all from you. Shut the fuck up. If you were going to marry me, if you weren't shut up, I should have knocked your damn silly head off your shoulders. I'm sorry, did you just say that if you were engaged to be married, you would beat her? I think you just said that if she was in fact your fiancé, you would beat her for defending herself when she had been attacked by somebody you convinced to go investigating for something that terrified him, and then failed to even look for when he ran away terrified. But yes, Damaris is the one being absurd, and a pig, and violent and angry. He then, of course, changes the conversation to be about going to London. And Anthony continues here to just make it beautiful by insisting if she owes him anything to go to London. You want to know what would probably help the circumstances? If you actually sat her down and told her fully what's happening. Now, some people argue that Anthony does attempt to do this. So just after, like literally, just after, a sentence after saying, if you were my fiancé, I would beat you for what you've just done. Will you come to London? Damaris almost gaped. The question was so sudden. Will I what? She exclaimed. Why on earth should I go to London? Quentin, God's mercy save him now, offered you in a hole in a ditch. I offer you London. Quentin offered her a hole in the ditch, and then aggressively dragged her into it, and tried to forcibly keep her there. Anthony said, the reason is that the princes of heaven are in the world and you're not used to them. No, stop a minute and let me tell you. In your own language, you owe me that. He paused to choose his words. Something has driven Quentin into a panic and hiding. Something has turned your father away from his hobby to inaction and contemplation. Something frightened you all at the Berenger house the other night. Something has obsessed Foster and your friend Miss Wilmot till they attacked me yesterday evening. Yes, they did. I am not mad. Most notable festa. Something is sounding the world like thunder. Attacked you? What nonsense, Damaris cried. And you can stop and meet it if you choose, or you can come to London for a few days' grace at least. If this is a joke, if it is, he answered, all your philosophers and schoolmen were mad together, and your life's work is no more than a comparison of different scribblings in the cells of a lunatic asylum. At no time does Anthony calmly sit down and tell Damaris anything that's actually happened. No, he gets angry, yells the basics at her, and assumes that just because she doesn't go with him, it's because she's being ignorant and childish. You know who does get the rational sit-down conversation where Anthony explains what just happened? Mr. Richardson. Mr. Foster. Not Damaris. What is really frustrating about this is that Damaris is constantly undermined by being told she's been given enough information to understand what's going on when she hasn't been. Like, Quentin gets upset with her because she doesn't know what's going on. Anthony gets upset with her because she's supposed to know what's going on. Not that he's bothering to explain any of it. He's going to assume that she will refuse to listen to him. The perfect opportunity would have been right at this moment, when he said, I will explain it to you in your own words, and then doesn't. In fact, again, he derides her philosophies. Because she is kind of listening. She says, if this is a joke, that tells me that Damaris is listening and starting to believe it. He has brought up some good points about all of these changes happening. Something is happening here. If this is a joke, he can go on and say, it's honestly not. The other night, Quentin and I were walking, and we saw a lioness disappear and a lion reappear, and Mr. Berenger fell unconscious. Then, after that, your father and I were by Mr. Berenger's house when a butterfly appeared out of nowhere, sucked all the other butterflies in, and now Mr. Ty is not interested in butterflies. He's simply interested in thinking and praying. Quentin and I ran into the line again, and Quentin's gone off mad. Miss Wilmot, who collapsed screaming about the snake, is acting like a snake, and Mr. Foster has gotten violent. Does he explain any of that? No, he looks her in the face and says, well then the passion that you have with your writers, it's all nonsense, madmen. Why not explain something to her? Because that's not the point. That's not the story that we're being told. Because explaining to Damaris now would mean that she would get somewhere on her own merits. that her own reason would be enough to understand what's happening and to change her way. Just like her own guilt was enough for her to go to Anthony and explain what happened with Quentin. Even though she was in the right to defend herself. This entire text is telling us that Anthony is right. He is in charge, and very shortly we are going to see a transformation in Damaris when she becomes the meek and humble woman that she's supposed to be. And I've never despaired so much in reading a text than I have in this moment when I see Damaris as myself and she's wrong. Not incorrect, but everything she's doing, her passions, her defense of herself, her interest in not being subsumed by a gentleman who threatens violence, who fails to explain anything. He never even told her Quentin was missing. If she had been aware of it, she might have been more compassionate to the man, who refuses to listen to her when she said she doesn't want to get married. But hey, all of this is love. And Damaris will get past that, and Anthony will be a better person to her because of it. You want a toxic relationship? This is it. And it's not going to get better. Like I said, Anthony's connected to the eagle. He is the hero we're supposed to be cheering for. And Damaris is going to get her comeuppance. Ugh. Well, I guess I gotta keep reading. So, I'll get to it. Come along for the ride. And I'll talk to you next time.